In a time of crusades, endless battles, and a peninsula divided between faith and war, a king arose whose name thundered across the land. Alfonso I, the battler. Leader, relentless, strategist, brilliant, and champion of Christianity, Alfonso forged his legend through sword and conquest. From the mountains of the Pyrenees to the vast fields of the Ebro, his reign marked an era of glory and conflicts that would forever change history. This is the story of the man who earned his title on the battlefield. The story of the man whose legacy endures in the echo of the centuries. In the year 1104, the king of Aragon and Pamplona, Pedro I, died without an heir. And according to Aragonese law in these cases, the crown had to fall to the male brother Alfonso I, the battler. But first, let's take a look at how the peninsula is. One thing to highlight is that the Christian kings of the peninsula are forbidden by the Pope to join the Crusades to fight for Jerusalem. Arteso, Nainter, Juanites. Why is that? Well, because the Pope or the popes believed that they had their own crusade in this land, and only when all the Muslims had been expelled to Africa could they take part in the Crusades of the Holy Land. That being said, we see that Aragon and Pamplona only have one main enemy, the Taifa of Zaragoza, since they don't share a border with other Taifas and can't march to Jerusalem. But of course, they also have their disputes with the Kingdom of Leon and with some Catalan counties. With El Cid dead, Alfonso VI had continued fighting against the Almoravids. But in the year 1108, he would suffer a crushing defeat at the Battle of Ucles. I'll leave the link for you up here. In that encounter, his only male heir died. Meanwhile, the county of Barcelona was gradually annexing the rest of the counties, gaining more and more strength. And to the south of the kingdoms lies the Almoravid Empire. Alright, with this, of course, let's begin with the story of Alfonso I, the battler. I just said that there was no male heir to the throne for the Kingdom of Leon. So the crown would fall for the first time in history to a widow, Urraca, the eldest daughter of Alfonso VI. But watch out, she's not the first queen of the peninsula. She's the first reigning queen of Europe, and she's also an empress. Remember that the title of emperor fell to the kings of Leon. And to strengthen the advance of Christianity, in the year 1109, right after Alfonso VI died, Urraca married Alfonso I, the battler. Are you aware of what just happened? The powerful Kingdom of Leon and the kingdoms of Pamplona and Aragon have united. But not everyone will like this. Let's see. We have a common part in both kingdoms that seek unification, but most are reluctant to this. On one hand, we have the Galician nobles who were particularists, which we could compare to today's federalism. We have the clergy and the nobility of the Kingdom of Leon. Well, they refused to be governed by an Aragonese, although in reality what they feared was losing their privileges. They asked that Urraca govern Leon and that Alfonso I govern Aragon and Pamplona. And as for their heir, well, we would see. Lastly, Urraca's sister Teresa, who was married to Enrique and governed the county of Portugal. Careful, pay close attention to this couple and their county. Well, the first problem came that very same year. Pedro Froilaz was a Galician count who had gained power thanks to Urraca and her previous husband. In fact, he was the guardian of their son Alfonso Raimundes. It turns out that the count was afraid of losing his power, so he tried to proclaim Alfonso Raimundes king of Galicia. He did the right thing, it was legal. I don't want to get too caught up in a mess of laws, but to sum it up, if Urraca, after becoming a widow, remarried, it was written that Alfonso should inherit Galicia. No one said it had to be as a kingdom. The count already decided this. The most powerful Galician nobles supported this initiative, but the lesser Galician nobility, afraid that the others would gain too much power and end up destroying them, supported Urraca. A tremendous mess. We have a war between Urraca and her son, and at the same time a civil war among the Galicians themselves. The kings acted swiftly. El Batallador set out with Leonese, Castilian, and Aragonese troops from Toledo toward Galicia. He would take the geographical center of Galicia to hinder the rebels' communications and logistics. The Battle of Monterroso took place, in which El Batallador crushed the rebel forces. Now then, Alfonso wanted to set an example so he could face the Muslims, so he decided to carry out a campaign of repression. Terrible, so terrible that he became estranged from his wife Urraca. Would this be the seed of another civil war? With the Galicians pacified, for the moment the warrior set out to the east, but upon arriving in Toledo he received some harsh news. It turns out that the Taifa of Zaragoza, ruled by Almustain, maintained its independence from the Almoravids. But a fundamentalist faction was growing within and threatened a coup to overthrow the king. So he decided to launch a campaign against Olaite to improve his reputation. It was a disaster. The king himself died in the battle, and the pro-Almoravid faction took advantage to seize power. In May of the year 1110, the Taifa of Zaragoza was annexed to the Almoravid Empire. This was what the battler feared the most, because now he had the real enemy at his doorstep. Were there more marital disputes that bled the kingdom dry? I'm going to give a mega summary of these disputes so I don't bore you. In Galicia, supporters of creating an independent kingdom increased among the high nobility, and many particularists began to look favorably on an independent kingdom of Galicia. In turn, Teresa and Henry, Counts of Portucalense, made deals with all sides, gaining their own benefit, heading toward a horizon that is taking shape in the distance, so that their county also becomes an independent kingdom. Urraca agrees that Alfonso Raimundes will be crowned King of Galicia, and that in the future, he will inherit the Kingdom of Leon. Finally, 5 years after getting married, Alfonso the Battler and Urraca separate. The county of Portugal declares itself independent. We could say that the Kingdom of Portugal is born here, although it would not be officially recognized until 2 decades later. Now Alfonso the Battler, single again, can focus on what interests him most: fighting the Almoravids and taking Zaragoza. To do this, he sent messengers to France and the neighboring territories, calling for a crusade on the peninsula. In May of the year 1118, Alfonso the Battler had an impressive army with experienced crusader warriors from the wars in the Holy Land. The crusaders were led by Gaston de Bern, but of course the crusaders were integrated into Alfonso's army. To give an idea of the size of the army, Alfonso had 20 catapults. The army set out for battle. On May 22nd, 1118, the Crusaders arrived near the city of Zaragoza. At that time, Zaragoza had more than 20,000 Muslims in addition to the Christian population. The siege would be costly, but necessary. However, Alfonso decided to tighten the siege little by little, instead of launching a full assault. These are the Roman walls of Zaragoza, practically the only ones the city had. We have outside the walls a large number of houses in neighborhoods known as arrabales. One to highlight is the Arrabal de Altabas, which had its own garrison. And why could there be soldiers here outside the walls? Because this arrabal covered the entrance to the bridge that led to Zaragoza. It had to be protected. Another position to highlight is the Aljaferia, which is located here. It is a Muslim palace, residence of the kings of the extinct Taifa of Zaragoza. It had solid walls and was easily defensible. Of course, it also had a garrison. What we're seeing is a defense in depth, with several protective layers. Alfonso decided that they would first take the Arrabal of Altabas. While they were forming around the city, he prepared orders to take the bridgehead leading to the city. On May 29th, Gaston de Bern, leading the European Crusaders, crossed to the other side of the river and reinforced the units covering the suburb. The next day, May 30th, Gaston de Bern led the charge. Against those positions, the Saracen garrison tried to hold their ground. They had set up barricades in the streets to gain an advantage over the Christians. In fact, these barricades prevent the use of the dreaded heavy cavalry. However, the foot crusaders charged and drove the Saracens out of the Arabal, forcing them to flee across the bridge to take refuge. Behind the walls? The Arabal of Altabas was in Aragonese hands outside the walls. Only the garrison of the Aljaferia remained, which, if it did not receive help, would be annihilated either by force of arms or by hunger. Knowing this days after the fall of the suburb, the Saracen troops of Zaragoza made a sortie to try to link up with the Muslims in the palace. Their intention was to rescue them and thus reinforce the city walls, but to do so they would have to overcome the Christian defenses. As soon as the Muslims approached the Crusader lines, the alarm was raised and the troops rushed in droves to reinforce the point that was being attacked. The heavy cavalry came in from one flank, ready to charge as soon as the order was given. The Muslims in the palace did not come out or try to link up with their rescuers. It would have been useless. After a few minutes of fighting at the front, the heavy cavalry received the order to charge from the flank. They lowered the visors of their helmets, lowered their lances, spurred their mounts, and crashed into the Saracen flank. The Muslim troops were falling by the dozens. There came a point when they were suffering so many casualties that saving the garrison of the Aljaferia would be pointless, so the retreat was ordered. The next day, the Aljaferia surrendered. The city was completely surrounded. As soon as news of the siege reached Granada, there was an uproar. No one wanted Zaragoza, the city that had just been annexed by the Almoravid Empire, to fall into Christian hands. A powerful army was mobilized and immediately marched north to rescue the city. The army advanced without rest, and a handful of days after setting out, they arrived at the former Taifa of Zaragoza. The army was not as powerful as the Crusaders, so they did not want to fight in open field. They stayed nearby until in September they made a risky decision to reinforce the garrison. They gathered all their horsemen and sent them to Zaragoza. The Almoravid cavalry had a difficult mission: to break through the Christian defenses from the rear and reach the safety of the walls. To do this, they formed a long column and charged at full speed against the Christian positions closest to the walls. The Christians did not expect this action, so they did not have much time to react. The pickets in the area grouped together and formed a solid front, a wall of shields meant to stop the charge. However, the Almoravids dodged them and managed to get inside the city. Question: was it a wise decision? Let's suppose there were, 1,000 horsemen. That's 1,000 more mouths to feed for a city that already has no food. And that's not even counting their horses. We could say that they would prevent the Christians from taking the walls, sure. But the Christians aren't assaulting the walls. What Zaragoza needed was food, not more men. The months of siege went by, and hunger and hardship reigned both inside and outside the city. Would it be a test of endurance, of resilience? But then at the beginning of November of that same year, the leader of the Granadan reinforcement army died, which was a hard blow to Muslim morale. In fact, that army probably disbanded and returned to their homeland. Since a month later, on December 18th of the year 1118, Zaragoza surrendered. And what happened to the civilians? Something that left both Christians and Muslims speechless. Alfonso the Battler ordered that those who wished to leave the city could do so, and take with them whatever treasures they possessed. Those who stayed would keep their religion, their laws, their properties, and would pay the same taxes as before. Only one condition: they would have to move to the suburbs, no living inside the city walls. This would prevent problems like those suffered by Cid in Valencia, whose story you can learn about in the link I leave for you above. Alfonso made the decision to quickly Christianize the region, so he organized caravans of settlers from the north to repopulate the city. This greatly increased the population of Zaragoza. Within a matter of weeks, a new chapter was now opening for the Kingdom of Aragon. With Zaragoza under his control, he could expand in all directions, although we'll see this in the next chapter. Year 1119. After Alfonso the Battler conquered Zaragoza, he didn't stay idle and took advantage of the momentum to conquer nearby towns like Tudela or Tarazona. He also repopulated almost deserted areas, such as Osoria. The loss of Zaragoza was a hard blow, a very painful defeat that would be difficult to accept. The Almoravid Empire, moreover, was having internal problems. Al-Andalus is dissatisfied with its leaders, while in Africa there is a new fundamentalist movement that threatens their power. Almoravid, the Almohads. For this reason, it was necessary to achieve a great military victory, a victory that would make their people believe in the Almoravid ruler again. Yusuf Este mobilized a powerful army that would be commanded by his brother Ibrahim. Professional troops from all over Al-Andalus answered the call, but he also proclaimed the Holy War. Thousands of volunteers joined the host, all with the same goal: to conquer Zaragoza. The army gathered in Valencia, and once it was ready in the spring of the year 1120, the Muslim hosts set out for war. And where was Alfonso in the meantime? Well, the battler was besieging Calatayud, taking advantage, as I mentioned before, of the momentum from the conquest of Zaragoza. Keep in mind that his men were in high spirits while the Almoravids were completely demoralized. If Calatayud fell, the Kingdom of Aragon would have an important stronghold from which to continue expanding southward. And alongside the Aragonese monarch was William of Aquitaine, who, just like Gaston de Bern did during the siege of Zaragoza that we saw in the previous episode, joined Alfonso's crusade. A curious fact about William of Aquitaine: did he own more land than the King of France himself? He was a veteran of the battles in the Holy Land. He was excommunicated twice, and he was the first poet in a Romance language. A knight worthy of Game of Thrones. Well, he came with 600 knights to serve in the Aragonese armies. When Alfonso found out that the Almoravids were marching towards Zaragoza, he decided to go meet his enemies. He couldn't trust the defense of the city to the garrison. The city was still socially unstable, and its defenders were not numerous. He left a small force to maintain the siege of Calatayud and set out to stop the Saracens. The problem was that he had few knights, infantrymen, and armed peasants, and this was the case because after conquering so many fortresses, he had been forced to leave garrisons along the way, dwindling his forces. His army now had two options. On one hand, go to Zaragoza to defend the city. Yes, the Almoravids were not good at assaulting cities, but they could force it to surrender by starvation. And besides, in the city, the heavy Aragonese cavalry would be of no use. The other option was to intercept the Muslim army on the way. And where could he attack the Muslims? Since he was clearly outnumbered, he couldn't face them in open field. Yes, he could take advantage of the power of a heavy cavalry charge to crush the enemy front. But if that wasn't enough and the enemy didn't retreat, they could rush at his men and tear them apart. Alfonso decided that the place for the battle would be Cutanda, in a small valley known as Celada or Campos de la Matanza. Can you imagine why? Now, even though this was Alfonso Thurn's greatest victory,
the battler,
there is a lot of confusion among the different chronicles. Although it has been possible to partially reconstruct what happened, I will add my slight cinematic touch to this reconstruction, modifying some superficial aspects. Since the place is known as Celada, it is most likely that Alfonso the Battler gathered his men at the top of this hill. The heavy cavalry, following Western tradition, was positioned at the front, and behind them were the infantry and lesser nobles. Between the infantry and the cavalry were the archers. Soon, the first Saracen scouts entered the valley, scanning the peaks and the road, in search of threats to his army. The Aragonese monarch had strategically positioned troops throughout the valley. lone soldiers who were supposed to stealthily take out these scouts. Little by little, with an arrow, a knife in the back, or a sword strike, the Muslims were taken down, and of course their bodies were moved off the path and the blood was covered with dirt. Nothing was left to reveal the executions. These Aragonese ran back to their army when the Almoravid dust cloud was seen at the entrance of the valley. The Saracen army, thinking that Alfonso was still in Calatayud, besieging the city, and with no news from the scouts, they advanced without fear, moving deeper into the valley, more and more in formation, in column. At the front, the peasants who had joined the jihad advanced, while at the rear marched the professional warriors. Alfonso was watching the enemy column from behind a bush, with one hand raised, ready to rise and give the order to attack. When he saw the right moment, he lowered his hand, and immediately the war drums began
to roar.
The thunder of the percussion rolled down the hillside, bounced off the opposite side, and echoed throughout the valley, as if an army of 100,000 men was lying in wait. The Aragonese archers opened fire, launching a continuous rain of arrows into the sky. Before the first one had even begun to fall, the second had already been fired. And when the first arrow fell on the enemy column, the third was already flying. They had to overwhelm the Muslims, not let them think, make them believe that Alfonso's army was 10 times bigger. Thursday Norasada, Dosin Indicanita Reality, Cut. The heavy cavalry set out, this time with little depth, since they had to cover the entire front to once again give the impression of being more. The knights descended at a trot, while the Saracens kept their shields up, trying to protect themselves from a rain of projectiles. Suddenly the sound of bows firing stopped, and the last of the arrows fell upon the Almoravids. They lowered their shields, looked at the hillside, and fear overtook them. Thousands of armored French and Aragonese knights were riding downhill toward them. Men and horses covered in steel, masses of flesh and iron galloping at full speed in a tight formation against them. It's not easy to stand firm in the face of such a charge, and even less so for a mere armed civilian. The knights lowered their lances, spurred their mounts one last time, and crashed into those poor devils. The charge was one of the most devastating those men had ever carried out. They broke through the Aracene lines as if they were butter. The Almoravids were struck, thrown from their positions, trampled by the horses, impaled by the lances, and slashed by the Christian swords. A massacre. The knights entered from one side and came out galloping from the other side with fewer than a dozen casualties. Behind them, they had left more than 200 dead and an even greater number of wounded. The Saracens turned around and faced the knights, trying to recover from the surprise and the shock they had received. They pressed close to each other and watched as the Franco-Aragonese cavalry regrouped. However, a sharp whistling sound began to be heard in the air, a whistle that kept growing louder, until it gave way to the clatter of hundreds of arrows falling on the unprotected backs of the Almoravids. The Muslims turned again, 180 degrees to face the arrows. But between the raised shields they could see a swarm of Aragonese infantry appearing over the crest of the hill and charging downhill. The Muslim officers tried to coordinate the militias, but it was an impossible task. These armed civilians, blinded by their holy war, only rushed forward to join the front lines and face the enemy. And the regular infantry, which could save the day, did not come as reinforcements. Their officers still refused to send in their troops. They preferred that the Aragonese get tired, wear themselves out killing the militiamen, something similar to the Battle of Zaragoza. But once again, a terrifying sound began to be heard, the thunder of hundreds, thousands of horse hooves at a gallop. The Saracen militias that were facing the Aragonese infantry. He didn't see the blow coming. Alfonso's heavy cavalry struck the Almoravids from behind. Their swords rose and fell, staining their armor with blood, flooding the valley with the blood of Islam. Once again, the Muslim formation broke apart, and the knights were able to break through the enemy ranks like the prow of a ship, cutting through a calm sea. After breaking through their enemies, the knights moved to the sides, making way for the Aragonese infantrymen who were looking for their own share of the fight. The militiamen who were not yet fighting kept pushing forward to join the fray, but the civilians who were already fighting no longer wanted to continue. After 2 cavalry charges, should the Christian infantry roar as they charged? It was too much. They started to fall back, but they couldn't. Because the ones behind were pushing forward, they were doomed. The Aragonese infantry clashed with the militias and overran them. The officers of the professional Saracen infantry, seeing how things were unfolding, ordered the retreat. In an orderly fashion, they left the valley at the highest speed possible. Because they knew that the worst part wasn't the battle, the worst was what came after. The pursuit of an army fleeing in terror. But the militias didn't know this. The armed civilians keep pushing forward, joining the fray. But soon they would lose either their morale or their lives. The push into Aragon was unstoppable. Finally, despair took hold of their hearts, and all at once they stopped trying to advance. The Almoravid army that remained in the valley turned around and began to retreat. But Alfonso could not allow those men to save their lives today, only to return to fight again. And the next day, an order was given. The Aragonese infantry stopped and the cavalry charged in a pursuit that lasted for kilometers. The defeat was so great that even the Muslim chronicles acknowledged it was a disaster, something very unusual. In fact, a saying remained for several centuries that went, "Worse was the one at Cutanda," which gives us an idea of the magnitude of the Muslim disaster that took place. The Muslim chronicles do emphasize that no regular soldiers died, that all the losses were militiamen. After the victory, Alfonso the Battler returned to Calatayud and ended the siege by entering the city in triumph. The kingdom of Aragon now extended as far as Sigüenza. And what was the situation in the peninsula? Do you remember that in the previous episode Alfonso VI had arranged in his will the marriage between his daughter Urraca and Alfonso the Battler to unify the peninsula? Well, that dream has gone up in smoke. What is known as the Spain of the Five Kingdoms is starting to take shape. Yes, Spain doesn't really exist yet, but that's what it's called. Portugal is rapidly heading toward independence. Under the leadership of Teresa Leon, Galicia and Castile remain united, but Castile has already tasted what it's like to be an independent kingdom and will soon be one again. Aragon and Pamplona are under the same crown for now, and in the east the county of Barcelona continues to expand and annex its neighbors, considerably increasing its power. We'll see how all of this continues to evolve in the next episode. After the capture of Zaragoza and the overwhelming victory at Cutanda, Alfonso's fame was sky high. He was the warrior who had succeeded El Cid as the most powerful man in Christendom, and of course his victories resonated throughout the entire peninsula. And who decided to try their luck against Alfonso the Battler? The Mozarabs of Granada. It turns out that the Mozarabs were Christians who lived under Saracen rule, but of course they lived in subjugation. To begin with, they had to pay extra taxes just for being Christians. Apart from that, of course, they were considered a lower class in society. This got worse with every fundamentalist wave that came from Africa. After the arrival of the Umayyad Caliphate, Abd al-Rahman came to establish the Umayyad Emirate, following the revolt in Bassi. The Almoravids would also arrive, and then the Almohads, each overthrowing the previous government for its supposed tolerance toward Christians. This is the opposite of how Alfonso the Battler acted when he took Zaragoza, where he treated the Muslims as equals. Of course, one way will generate unrest and ultimately rebellions, while the other surely will not. It turns out that the Mozarabs of Granada asked the Aragonese monarch for help to take the city and liberate them. Take a look at the map. What they're asking is for the Aragonese troops to leave from the Ebro, reach the heart of the Almoravid Empire, and take such an important city. And to support their request, they promised the Battler that 12,000 men from Granada would join the Army of Salvation, as soon as their banners appeared on the horizon. Of course, we're talking about if Alfonso arrived with his troops near Granada. Inside the walls, 12,000 men would rise up in arms. Victory guaranteed. And of course, the news would spread like wildfire throughout the entire Almoravid Empire. And would the Christian population imitate their actions? Achieving in 1 or 2 campaigns the overthrow of Muslim power, and establishing a Christian principality in its place, which, just like in Zaragoza, would tolerate the Muslims to avoid an uprising. Identical to the principalities of Antioch and Tripoli, or the famous Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was a complicated plan, but Alfonso didn't say no to an adventure and accepted the proposal. Would he march south with his men? Do you remember what Alfonso Urraca did when he sacked Lisbon without opposition? Well, this would be an even bolder campaign. Alfonso the Battler prepared the campaign thoroughly. He summoned troops from Navarre, Aragon, and his allies from the south of France, assembling an army of 5,000 knights and 15,000 infantrymen. An incredible army. But it was only natural. He needed to set out with at least a minimum guarantee of victory. He was joined, of course, by the French crusader Gaston de Bern, whom we met at the taking of Zaragoza on September 2nd, 1125. The Crusader army set out for war. I said Crusader, even though that campaign was not an official crusade decreed by the Pope. The fact is that for those men it was a crusade, because they set out to fight to defend the Christians who were under Islamic rule. The army set out for Valencia, because he had also received a request for help from the Mozarabic Christians of Valencia. As the Aragonese host approached the capital, groups of Mozarabic Christians joined their forces. The surrounding regions and some of the Mozarabic Christians of Valencia also left their homes and joined the Aragonese. The Almoravid governor, upon hearing the news, hastily prepared the city's defenses, as he did not want Valencia to fall back into Christian hands, barely 20 years after having recovered it. However, the Battler passed by and kept marching. Wherever he went, streams of Christians joined him. The rumor of his campaign echoed strongly, and it was no longer seen as a crusader army but as a liberation army. Alzira Shativa Denia Orihuela. His Mozarabs marched with Alfonso. From there he reached Murcia, followed the coast and entered Almeria, now heading towards Granada. In the village of Grana, the army celebrated Christmas and prepared for the final assault, the climax of the campaign. At that time, according to the chronicles, the army had 50,000 men. However, it is most likely that this figure is an exaggeration. And besides, many of the Mozarabs are not professional warriors but rather conscripts, so they're not of very good quality either. And that will have to be taken into account in battle. On January 7th, 1126, Alfonso the Battler saw the walls of Granada for the first time. However, he did not camp next to it, but about 14 kilometers away in Nibar. But of course, they had been on campaign for 4 months, and Yusuf had had time to prepare the defense. All the Almoravid armies had gathered in the city to defend it. Even warriors from the African garrisons had arrived. Now we have a very large Christian army that has to survive off the land, which, by the way, is also receiving supplies from the Mozarabs in the area. On the other hand, we have the Saracen army, well protected behind the walls of Granada and very well supplied. And I ask you, isn't someone missing? Where are the 12,000 men that the Mozarabs of Granada promised? Well, ladies and gentlemen had backed out. They blamed the Aragonese monarch, claiming that he had taken too long, and that the Muslims had been able to gather their forces. They no longer took up arms for fear of dying without achieving anything. Thank you, Sombra. Big problem. Alfonso was hundreds of kilometers away from his kingdom, or at least from a Christian kingdom like Leon. He had tens of thousands of mouths to feed, and with each passing day the Muslims were getting stronger. The plan had failed. Would this be the Battler's first failed campaign? On January 23rd, 1126? Alfonso broke camp and set out with his men. Where to? To Granada? Back to Aragon? No. He marched toward the heart of Andalusia, passed through Macarena, Pinos, Alcalá, La Real, all the way to Écija, very close to Seville, and there he turned back, heading toward Cabra. What was he looking for with this incursion? I'd say it's not known. Maybe it was an attempt to devastate the area, so that the campaign wouldn't be a complete disaster. The fact is that at all times General Abu Bakr was pursuing him with a civilian army, stalking him, harassing his patrols, and finishing off the warriors who fell behind. Abu Bakr was Viriato and the Aragonese were the Romans. By the way, if you want to know the story of Viriato, you can find it up here. Weeks went by and Tamim, governor of Granada with his own troops, was trying to block the path of the battler, so that he would be forced to fight and most likely to die. After 6 months of campaigning, the Saracens managed to surround Alfonso's army at Arnisol. Again, this battle is not well documented, so we are going to see a recreation of how it might have been. Based on what is known and filling in the many gaps, the map would look something like this. What the chronicles tell us is that Alfonso the Battler was surrounded by the Almoravid troops, and since separately the Aragonese could defeat first the army of Seville and then that of Granada, it's not likely that he was fleeing. The hypothesis we're going to start from is that Alfonso decided to set up his camp in this position, with one side covered by a steep hill from which it would be impossible to receive an attack. They spent the night there with their proper guard posts to prevent an enemy attack. The night was calm, but at dawn they saw that they were surrounded. The armies of Sevilla and Granada had positioned their troops around the Christian army during the night. Taking advantage of their knowledge of the terrain, they had executed the Christian pickets, so that the Aragonese would be unaware of the threat looming over them. At sunrise on March 10, 1126, Alfonso's heart sank. The alarm was quickly raised and all the Crusaders armed themselves and prepared for battle. However, the Muslims had time on their side, and during the morning they were content to slowly tighten the siege. They finally had the most famous knight of Al-Andalus since El Cid, the undefeated monarch who had taken large amounts of territory, to the caliphate. At last he would pay for his offenses. The Saracens were getting closer and closer, and Alfonso ordered the army to be divided into 4 large groups, and they withdrew toward the hill. Avoiding being crushed by the enemy's numerical superiority, the Muslims kept advancing and managed to reach the first tents of the Christian camp. However, no one looted them. They were so eager to defeat the battler that everyone wanted to take part in the battle. The hours went by, and at noon, Alfonso made a decision. If he had to die, he would die fighting. He would die fighting for Pamplona and Aragon, for his men, for his legacy, and for his God. He took up his shield, drew his sword, and rallied his men. Would it be the last time he saw them alive? All together they would ride toward death. They would be buried in Muslim territory, but they would be remembered for all eternity. But deep in his thirst, he still believed in victory. He felt God was on his side. That's what his priests assured him. He ordered his knights to form up beside him, and he charged forward, followed by the infantry. They couldn't give the enemy time to take action. The knights lowered their lances, galloped at full speed, and crashed into the Saracen lines that believed themselves victorious. The Almoravids were swept away by the horsemen. With Alfonso at the head, the heavy Crusader cavalry managed to break the siege by breaking through the enemy line and coming out the other side. The impact on enemy morale had been tremendous. They didn't know what was happening. No one expected it. Then came the charge of the Aragonese infantry. Men covered in steel, accompanied by desperate Mozarabs, charged, crying out to the heavens for victory. Blood ran through the valley, and soon the typical stench of urine, its harshness, took over the air. The rest of the Muslim troops charged forward to try to save their comrades. But it was a timid charge. Honestly, no one wanted to find out if what they said about the battler was true. They saw from afar how the knights' swords rose and fell upon their brothers, and they didn't want the same thing to happen to them. When the part of the siege that was attacked was destroyed, Alfonso pivoted his army to charge against the Almoravids. However, they did not want to fight. Tamino ordered a retreat to his own camp to put up resistance, but his men ignored him. The Almoravid army turned into a leaderless mob. Anarchy set in. Some advanced, others stayed to fight, while others slowly retreated. Alfonso took advantage and charged at them, and it didn't take long to break them and make them flee. The Aragonese monarch was satisfied with having broken the front. He didn't want to pursue the enemy, fearing it might be an ambush. He ordered everyone to return to the camp, double the guards, and spend the night there. At sunrise, there was no one left in front of the Crusader army. Alfonso the Battler once again tasted victory. He decided to return to Granada to see if, now that he had defeated the enemy, the Mozarabs of the city would rise up in arms. But when he arrived, he found a new army that had come from Morocco. He made the decision. The campaign was over. He marched east until he reached Murcia, and from there continued north, pursued the entire time by the new Muslim army. The Aragonese finally, in June of that year, after 9 months of campaigning, returned to their kingdom tired and sick, without having achieved their goal of taking Granada. But of course, he had brought with him thousands and thousands of Mozarabs, and what did he do with them? He settled them in the surroundings of Zaragoza to ensure the loyalty of the territory, and when he arrived, they also gave him some news. Queen Urraca of Leon, his ex-wife, had died 2 days before the Battle of Arnisol. Alfonso the Battler, despite not having been defeated in battle, had failed to take Granada. But the worst was yet to come. Soon we'll see the Battler on multiple fronts, but we'll see that in the next episode. After returning from the campaign in Almoravid lands and solving a border problem with Leon, which, by the way, led him to renounce the imperial title of Leon, Alfonso the Battler decided to pursue his dream once again of giving Aragon access to the sea. He sent Gascon de Bern, already a veteran in the Aragonese army after the conquest of Zaragoza and the incursion into the Caliphate, to Fernando the Furin had tried and failed. El Cid had succeeded, but the city had fallen again. Now it was time for Alfonso the Battler to try. While the monarch was fighting the French north of the Pyrenees, specifically besieging Bayonne, Gascon was tightening the siege around Valencia. However, the Almoravids were clear that the Levantine city must not fall. A new army was sent to try to defeat the Aragonese, and, ladies and gentlemen, the undefeated army of the Batallador was defeated. Gascon, their leader, fell on the battlefield, and to celebrate the victory, the Almoravids decapitated him and sent his head to the capital as a trophy. The loss of those men, but above all the death of his friend Gascon de Bern, deeply affected Alfonso, who returned to Aragon to continue with his initial goal of reaching the sea. If he couldn't do it through Valencia, he would do it through the Ebro, conquering Lerida. During the year 1133, the Aragonese troops advanced like a steamroller towards the east, taking the towns they came across. And the Almoravids soon realized that they couldn't stop the Christians. And what did they do? Did they buy their safety by paying other Christians? Who? Well, to Ramon Berenguer, 4 Count of Barcelona. But what they did wasn't paying him to come to their aid. What the Muslims did was pay him so he wouldn't invade Lerida while they faced the battler. That is, they would pay him to, literally, do nothing. The Count of Barcelona accepted. And of course, when Alfonso found out, he was furious. He swore he would take the city of Fraga at any cost, and he would take it by storm. His troops arrived at the city and immediately laid siege to it, cutting off its food and reinforcements. The governors of Murcia and Valencia sent an army to liberate the city, but things did not go well. The Almoravids were crushed by the Aragonese and the siege continued. Months went by and the city of Fraga began to suffer the hardships of the siege, to such an extent that they offered the Aragonese monarch a negotiated surrender. However, the king rejected it. He had sworn to take the city by force and then sack it, and he was determined to keep his promise. During the spring of the year 1134, the Almoravids sent a real relief army to the city. Thousands of warriors from Seville, Granada, and Córdoba, reinforced by African contingents, marched to the rescue of Fraga, led by Ali, son of Lemire. The army was not as numerous as Alfonso's, but they were experienced troops and they were also fresh. Whereas the Aragonese were indeed very good troops. But with years of campaigns behind them and after several months of siege, let's say they were not at their best. The fact is that the reinforcement troops approached the city, and Alfonso decided to confront them in open field. However, it seems that instead of advancing with his entire army, he left, of course, a force in the camp, in case the defenders came out of the city. He sent only a group of knights. These knights charged and clashed with the Knights of Lerida, who were fighting for their own territory. A few minutes after the clash, more Almoravid knights arrived, who began to tip the balance in their favor. Alfonso the Battler, realizing that his idea of routing the reinforcement army with a single cavalry charge had failed. He took command of his men and led them into the open field, leaving, of course, a reserve to prevent the inhabitants of the city from escaping. The Aragonese monarch took command of the knights remaining in his army and led the attack against the Murcian and Valencian knights who were advancing toward him. The clash was tremendous. Riders from both sides were unhorsed, their steeds fell slain, neighing in pain, and blood splattered everywhere. But that day, even though the Christians had sent their prayers to the heavens, God was not with them on the battlefield. The remaining Almoravid knights ignored the Christian riders and headed straight for the Aragonese infantry, who were advancing quickly to meet them. The Christian foot soldiers were swept away by the impact of the charge. They were advancing so quickly to help their cavalry that they had broken formation and were left exposed to the Saracen riders. It was disheartening. The Aragonese banners, which were feared by the Muslims and had achieved dozens of victories without being defeated, were being stained with Aragonese blood. Alfonso, seeing that the battle was quickly turning into a defeat, decided to call in the reserves, but then he realized that everything was lost. The defenders of Fraga, seeing that the battle was taking place, rushed out through the gates and advanced against the Aragonese reserve at the camp. The Christians formed a shield wall to stop the charge, but the attack was so strong that they soon began to fall back. Not just fall back. Cracks began to appear in the front, gaps between the shields, breaches that weren't filled by the reserves because they themselves were the reserves. The last defensive line of the camp, Marital, fell, the formation broke apart, and the Aragonese from the camp fled in a rout. The men of Fraga set about executing all the Christian warriors they found, while the women of the city took the opportunity to loot the Christian camp and carry treasures and provisions back into the city. There were no reserves left, only one option remained. He had to accept his first defeat in battle. Alfonso the Battler, the undefeated king, ordered the retreat and acknowledged his first defeat. According to the chronicle, the entire royal guard, made up of 700 infantrymen, was annihilated. All the Aragonese knights in the battle died fighting. It was a crushing defeat. The survivors ran to Zaragoza to take refuge, while the Almoravids decided not to advance to conquer the city. Why? Not because they were pious or anything like that, but because they had their own internal problems. Problems that we will learn about in other videos. A few months later, on September 7th, 1134, Alfonso I of Aragon and Navarre, at 61 years old, after 30 years of reign, died. However, at his death he left a problem, a big problem. Do you remember that he had married Urraca of Leon? Okay, and then they separated, right? That's right. And did I say if he got married again during the series? No. Because he didn't get married again, and he didn't have any illegitimate children either, at least as far as we know. No children? What will happen to the kingdom? Civil war? Well, it turns out that while he was in Bayona, he wrote a will, probably one of the most controversial wills in all of history. He didn't leave his kingdom to a relative, he left it to the Crusader knights who guarded the holy places in Jerusalem. And I'm reading directly from the Testament. And so also, for after my death, I leave as my heir and successor the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and those who watch over and guard it. And there they serve God. To the hospital of the poor in Jerusalem and to the temple of the Lord, with the knights who watch there to defend the name of Christendom. To these three I grant my entire kingdom. Wow. From one day to the next, the crown of Aragon would fall to the military orders. But for this to happen, the crown would have to be handed over to the Pope. That is, the Papal States would control Aragon. Of course, not even drunk would the Aragonese people allow such madness. But was there any alternative? Well, if we go back in time, when Pedro died, Alfonso the Battler succeeded him, but it turns out there were 3 brothers. Ramiro is missing, the third one, the one in discord. And why was he in discord? Well, because at first he's excluded from the line of succession. Since he had been a monk since he was 9 years old, and now at 50, he was being asked to rule Aragon. But of course the Aragonese nobility had no other option. It was either that or the Pope. The nobility went to Jaca with Ramiro, and there he was crowned king, who would be known as Ramiro III the monk. After receiving the crown, he quickly went to Zaragoza, where he negotiated a truce with the Muslims in order to resolve the internal problems of the kingdom. It was September 29th, just 22 days after Alfonso died. But be careful. Let's remember that Alfonso was king of Aragon and Navarre or Pamplona, and the people of Navarre didn't think the same as the people of Aragon. To explain this, let's look at a family tree. Sancho Ramirez of Aragon in the year 1076. He had murdered his own brother, Sancho Garces, and had taken over the Navarrese crown. But this Garces had a brother, Prince Ramiro Sanchez, who had married Cristina. And who was this Cristina? None other than the daughter of El Cid Campeador, whom you can learn about in the link I leave for you up here. Cristina and Ramiro had a son, Garcia Ramirez. The Navarrese nobles decided to regain independence and named Garcia Ramirez the Restorer as King of Pamplona in the year 1134. And Ramiro, the monk, didn't say anything. Well, they reached an agreement. Ramiro adopted Garcia Ramirez and allowed him to be King of Pamplona, while he would be King of Aragon. Let me make a side note about something I found funny while researching this period. Seriously? Sancho Ramirez, Sancho Garces, Ramiro Sanchez, Garcia Ramirez. Did they only have 3 names to mix and match? Couldn't they be a bit more inventive? It's not a joke, it just amused me. I'll continue, Vale. Aragon and Pamplona have already agreed to a truce, and how do we go our separate ways? But what about Alfonso VII, King of Leon? Didn't he say anything? Of course he did. Absolutely. Instead of diplomacy, he sent his troops to take Zaragoza itself, which, by the way, didn't even put up a fight. Zaragoza and all the surrounding cities gladly surrendered to Alfonso VII, since they saw him as the only one capable of facing the Almoravid threat. But the church reacted furiously. What was this about ignoring the testament of Alfonso the Battler? If the testament said that the crown fell to the Papal States, then that's how it had to be. But we'll see this in another episode. Greetings and strength and honor.